In this video, we're going to finish up our discussion on Chapter 26 and kind of the fundamentals of GDP by talking about some of the problems that we have when we are using GDP as a measure of output and welfare. Right? Kind of just by the definition, that's what GDP is telling us. On the output front, right? How productive is the society? How much is being made, right? But we also use it as a measure of welfare because the higher the GDP, right, usually the higher the standard of living, the better off people are. So we're going to look at these. All right, we're going to start by talking about some of the problems with GDP as a measure of output. All right, so there are kind of two things that we're going to focus on here. For this video, I might not be writing everything down that I say. This is more just kind of a discussion about these different topics, but they are important. All right, so the first problem with GDP as a measure of output is the shadow economy. All right, so shadow economy, probably have heard it more commonly referred to as kind of the black market, although that kind of doesn't really cover everything in the shadow economy. This is anything from kind of things that are illegal and illicit, like the drug trade or prostitution or anything like that, as well as, you know, kind of things that are technically illegal, but or might be considered illegal, but aren't as illicit, right? Like kind of having a business without a business license, right? Running a business out of your home, right? Accepting money without really reporting that to the government, right? Going around mowing people's yards and just getting paid in cash, getting paid under the table, right? All of that falls into the kind of the purview of the shadow economy. All right, so the reason why the shadow economy gives us trouble when we're using GDP as a measure of output is that the productivity of illegal transactions are not accounted for. Right, so again, I do want to point out that we're not just talking about kind of what we might consider the more illicit aspects of the shadow economy, right? However, those do definitely fall into this, right? Just because something's illegal doesn't mean it's not productive, right? Kind of depends on how you define productivity, right? In much of economics literature, right? Essentially, are you kind of providing a service to somebody, right? So if you're providing a good or service to somebody in exchange for money, right? That's productive, right? If both parties are kind of made better off, so on and so forth, right? That is productive activity. Right? So whether you agree with it or not on a moral standpoint, right? Things like prostitution and kind of the drug trade are, in many cases, productive, could be considered productive activities, right? Again, those aren't going to be accounted for. Big reason, the government is the one that really puts this stuff together and calculates GDP, and if you're doing something illegal, right, you're not going to tell the government about it, right? That just makes sense, right? But also kind of the less illicit stuff, some of the stuff that even isn't necessarily illegal, like, you know, your kid mows your yard, you give them $5 or whatever it is now, right? That's productive activity, right? Value has been created by somebody cutting the yard, right? But since it was paid under the table, right, that's not getting counted towards GDP, right? And then you take that up to the things that are similar but definitely are illegal, like actively working under the table, not just giving your kid $5 for mowing the yard, right? that's not reported either, right? One of the reasons you're working under the table is you don't want to pay taxes in a lot of cases, all right? And so that's not going to get reported. That's not going to get accounted for, all right? I've known friends in the restaurant industry that pay taxes on their kind of credit card tips and their wages like that, right? But any cash tips, they just take those and go on, right? That's productivity that's not being accounted for, right? That's a part of the shadow economy, right? And this is not necessarily a small thing. For America, right? So the U.S. and Western Europe, right, it's estimated that let's see. That's not good either. All right, so for the U.S. and Western Europe, right, it's estimated that shadow economy is 10 to 20% of GDP, all right? So the activity on the shadow economy, right, in the US and Western Europe, right, anywhere from, it's the size of it is anywhere from 10 to 20% of GDP, probably depending on which country you're looking at, so on and so forth, all right? But that's not an insubstantial amount. All right, for Latin America, all right, it's estimated, right, to be 41% of GDP, all right? And again, most of this is not necessarily going to be kind of illicit stuff, right? It might just be that you're having to kind of do things under the table or do things unofficially to actually get the things that you need to survive or that you just want. Let's be honest, that's going to happen as well, right, in some of those countries, right? So the problem is that when we don't include the shadow economy into GDP, and it's difficult to do it. There's a reason it's not included, because it's very difficult, because people don't want to report that, so on and so forth, right? But it understates the productivity of a country. It also understates the kind of welfare of a country, right? Country with a high kind of percentage of black market, or shadow economy, or the large shadow economy, right? They're probably better off than their GDP reflects. All right, so that is one way that GDP kind of fails as a measure of output. All right, the next one has to do with non-priced production. All right, so with non-priced production, all right, kind of the problem here is that productivity that does not result in a monetary transaction is not accounted for in GDP. All right, so if there's no monetary transaction, then kind of that productive activity is not accounted for in GDP. So things like volunteer work, right? That is productive, right? But that's not going to be accounted for in GDP, because it's non-priced, right? Other things like homemaking, right? If you're going to be a stay-at-home parent, right, then you're not going to get paid for that because nobody's going to pay you to watch your own kids, right? That's still productive activity, right? Just because they're your kids doesn't make it unproductive. And your book brings up a good point, kind of a little example talking about how, you know, as more women, all right, were moving out of the home and into the workforce, right? We also saw an increase in the number of kind of nannies and things like that, right? So obviously, right, that what they were doing at home was productive because now when they left, right, somebody's being able to get paid to do that, right? It's just that not for your own kids, essentially, right? You're not going to get paid for your own to watch your own kids. All right, so it's definitely productive activity, right? And it arguably should be accounted for in the GDP, but again, that's difficult to do, right? It's difficult to say how much is that worth, right? If you tried to quantify it, and then also the logistics of trying to get that information would probably be pretty tough as well. All right. Also things, you know, there are other things other than just volunteer work and non-priced labor, right? So some of the things your book mentioned are somebody writing a review on Amazon, right? That's productive if it helps people figure out if they want to buy a good or not, but they didn't get paid for it, so it's not priced. And that kind of made me think of people that write fan fiction, right? Other people presumably read it and enjoy it, right? That's productive activity, but they're not getting paid for it, right? And so arguably that should be included in GDP as well. All right, so those two were the ones that kind of more solidly were about problems as far as output goes. Now let's talk a little bit about welfare, all right? So these are problems with GDP as a measure of welfare. All right, so again, kind of overall how well off people are. All right, so some of these I'm definitely not going to write a ton for. All right. All right, so with this first one, leisure, all right, I'm just going to ask a question. Are we better off than Europeans, right? As far as kind of economics goes, so on and so forth, all right? Well, by looking at GDP or GDP per capita, it would look like we are better off than many European countries, all right? However, one thing that's not taken into account in this is leisure time, right? Americans work more on average than most European, or in America, workers, you know, work longer on average than workers in most European countries, right? And because we work longer hours, we work more, right? That's going to lead to an increase in GDP, just like an increase in your population size would also lead to an increase in GDP, right? Right, does that mean that we're better off, right? If we're working all the time, right, increasing our GDP, does that really mean that we're better off? This is a question that's up for debate, right? But a lot of people would say, no, probably not, right? Because Europeans usually have shorter work days, right? They have more vacation days. They have a lot of things where they can take advantage of leisure time more than the United States, right? But again, if you're just looking at GDP or GDP per capita, right, it's going to look like the U.S., right, is better off than a lot of the other European countries. America is not a European country. Than, all right, a lot of the countries in Europe, and kind of usually more we're comparing U.S. to Western Europe, right? And so we're going to see that there. All right, but that's all we're going to really say for that one. Again, you know, there's a trade-off between work and leisure, right? Who's to say kind of which one's which one makes us better off? All right. The next one is negative externalities. All right. So you will hear more about externalities if you take the micro course, so we don't need to worry too much about not really knowing that. We're not going to get too deep into it, but essentially an externality is just a side effect of some exchange that affects people outside of the exchange. All right. So if I am trading with this other person, right, and the trade that we have affects another person, right, that's an externality. Right. So a negative externality. All right, one of the most common ones is pollution, but there are some other ones that might fit into here. All right, but this one's definitely the big one. All right, negative externalities like pollution are not accounted for in GDP. Right, if we just had more factories running on coal, right, we might, pumping stuff out and pumping smoke into the air, right? We might have a higher GDP because we're selling more stuff, right? But our air quality might really decrease. And so, are we better off at that point, right? That again, kind of more normative questions, right? Kind of opinion-based questions, but the effects of production, like pollution, right, are not accounted for. All right. So again, that is one problem. Again, we're going to burn through these last ones because I really just like talking about the shadow economy, so I spent most of the time on that. But again, those negative externalities, all right, things like pollution, those are not accounted for. Arguably, they should be, but again, it's difficult to take them into account. All right, and then last but not least, distribution of income. All right, so when we are looking at GDP or GDP per capita, all right, we can't really see who is being made better off. All right, and so if we have a situation where GDP is increased to a great extent, but it kind of only benefits a few people, especially if it's at the cost or at the expense of a larger group of people, right? Then that might not, that increase in GDP might not really give us a good idea about changes in welfare, right? Even if just a few people are made a lot better off, right, and that really increases GDP, right? If a bunch of other people are made a lot worse off, all right, or even, well, anyways, or just made worse off, then arguably GDP's not doing a great job of showing those changes in welfare, all right, and in well-being, all right? Again, with a lot of these welfare ones, it's very subjective, all right? It's a very normative statement. They're going to be based on kind of your opinions, your values, and so on and so forth. All right, but they are things to think about when we are using GDP. All right, now at the end of all of this, I will say, again, GDP is a very good measure, right? It does have some problems. It's important for us to acknowledge those problems, right? But it's still very good. It's one of the best tools we've got. There's a reason a lot of this stuff isn't included in GDP, and the reason is because it would be really difficult to include it, right? If somebody had figured it out, they probably would have included it already, but as of yet, right, we kind of just have to work with what we've got. All right, but that is it for chapter 26. The next chapter we will be going over is chapter 27. this one's going to be, chapter 27 is going to be pretty short. We're really going to be just talking, now that we've talked about GDP, we're going to talk a little bit about growth, all right? What causes growth, all right? Why growth is important, so on and so forth, all right? But that will be in the next video, and I'll see you then.